This lesson is titled Ethics and Economics. First of all, I would like to make clear that ethics is one thing and economic science is another. Ethics deals with what ought to be, with the rules that should guide our behavior, while economic science studies the laws that shape the processes of social cooperation. Sometimes it is said, though this terminology leads to grave errors, that economic science is a positive science, and that ethics is a normative science. One deals with what is, and the other with what ought to be. However, this terminology is highly misleading, because when economics is referred to as a positive science, it is usually implied that economics is an empirical science. People confuse the study of what is with the study of historical events. As we learned at the beginning of the course, economic science is not an empirical science. That is getting it backward. The methodology used in economics must be a prioristic deductive. To put it another way, we cannot approach the huge mass of historical events which surround us if we are not equipped with prior theoretical knowledge that permits us to interpret them. All facts are theory-laden, as Popper used to say. Popper is not a hero of mine, but he was quite right about this. Indeed, I would go even further than Popper does. In social science, there are no facts outside of theory. It is always necessary to have a prior theory in order to interpret and comprehend real events. Even the most ardent empiricist invariably, without realizing it, or more or less surreptitiously, under the table, uses a theoretical model to interpret what goes on around him. Hence, the term positive science leads to error to the extent that with respect to methodology, people think it means economics is an empirical science. When this term is used properly, what we mean is that economic science studies what is, without regard to what is good or bad, or what ought to be. These are normative considerations, and fall within the sphere of ethics. So, economic science must be a science free from value judgments, Wertfreiheit in German. Free from value judgment means that the economic scientist, as a scientist, cannot judge as good or bad the specific ends pursued by the actors she is studying. For we research human action and its implications, and human actions pursues ends and seeks out means to achieve those ends, regardless of whether those ends appear to us to be good or bad. Therefore, economic science, as such, is a science free from value judgments. Nevertheless, though it is a science concerned with what is and not with what ought to be, even if we recognize the radical separation between economics and normative disciplines like ethics, which is concerned with what ought to be, scientific economic studies are enormously useful in adopting ethical stances. Imagine, for instance, someone, and we cannot criticize him from the outside, who, for whatever reason, attaches very great value to equality. He is a young, idealistic person who feels that egalitarianism is essential. And as scientists, we cannot make a value judgment from the outside about his views, whether or not we like them. However, if this idealistic person comes here, studies economic science, and realizes that imposing equality from above destroys the process of social cooperation, then, very possibly, he will question his subjective valuations. He will question his political values. This goal I was striving for in good faith and with such enthusiasm is incompatible with the process of social cooperation. Now I understand that establishing, using the coercive power of the state, measures which force egalitarian results from the social process destroys the social process. I understand, for example, that minimum wage laws harm precisely those they are supposedly designed to favor. So as a result of my study of economics in this course with Professor Huerta de Soto, I am reconsidering my political principles and values. I used to vigorously defend an ideal of equality, and I defended it not at the purely private, voluntary level, but at the public level. I felt that it legitimized state intervention to impose certain measures. Now I see the contrast between the advancement of civilization in a harmonious process of voluntary cooperation and the social chaos and violence generated by the forcible imposition of egalitarian measures, and I realize I must rethink my political position and change it. Therefore, even in the sphere of ethics, it is extremely useful to have sound knowledge of economic science, even if only for this reason. Yet someone could say, Professor, I accept everything you have taught about economics. But even so, I place such importance on egalitarianism that I consider the disappearance of civilization preferable to inequality. If someone takes such a maximalist position as this one, we as economic scientists still cannot judge this is good or this is bad. A different discipline would be necessary to reveal whether or not such a position is morally acceptable or correct. We would leave the sphere of economics, which, as we know, is a positive science and free from value judgments, and we would study a different discipline, ethics. That is, the scientific study of the principles that should shape social behavior. Ethics does deal with what is good and what is bad. Many theorists do not believe it is possible to develop an ethics discipline in objective terms, especially nowadays, when the most widespread subjectivism and relativism prevail in the spheres of morality and ethics. In contrast, I and a large group of other theorists do believe it is possible to develop an objective discipline of what is good or right and what is bad or wrong. To develop at least a social ethics in objective terms which different human beings can agree upon. I repeat, this is something that is questioned, but efforts have been made along these lines. Attempts to construct an objective science of ethics, one which could permit us even to prove that what someone is doing is ethically wrong. And in the development of this discipline of objective ethics, all of the intellectual, scientific knowledge of economics gained throughout this course plays a very important role as well. This knowledge helps and guides us in building our ideal ethical edifice, which we consider to be objectively good. Various research programs or efforts exist along these lines. There are natural law libertarians, for instance. They assert that there is an objective natural law, which is what I am referring to, and that it is the only law in keeping with human nature. We just have to discover it. Perhaps the most important of these theorists is Murray Rothbard, who develops an entire theory of social ethics in favor of capitalism, and based on the principle of self-ownership. I own my body, and as he demonstrates, no one else owns me. And if we accept this, then I also own what I produce and what I appropriate, as long as it did not belong to anyone else, the principle of occupatio re nullius. Furthermore, I can then voluntarily exchange with others the fruits of my efforts. In this way, Rothbard develops an objective ethics of voluntary social cooperation, the foundation on which the capitalist system rests. Meanwhile, coercive behaviors which consist of enslaving me and making someone else my owner, or of expropriating the fruits of my efforts, or of forcibly preventing the free, voluntary exchanges between people, are all essentially unethical and immoral acts that go against human nature. Robert Nozick, who was a philosophy professor at Harvard University and who died 16 years ago, also developed an entire objective theory of social ethics. His was less radical than Rothbard's, but in a similar vein. Another important line of research in this field is that of Professor Hans Hermann Hoppe, a German-born professor who studied under Habermas at the University of Frankfurt, later became a beloved disciple of Rothbard, and at the time of his retirement was an economics professor at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. He currently lives in Turkey. Habermas is a German Marxist philosopher who developed his philosophy based on the criterion of argumentation. Well, Hoppe was a disciple of this Marxist. And Hopper realized that the argumentation principle is on its soundest footing and has the richest implications when it is applied to justify objective ethics in favor of voluntary social cooperation in the capitalist system. To put it very briefly, though in the reading you will find a detailed explanation, the idea is as follows. If I talk and argue with another person, another I, for instance, well, I agree with this, well, I do not agree with that, well, yes, well, no, etc. Even if I am a capitalist and the other person is a socialist, the mere fact that we are conversing and offering arguments implicitly indicates that I accept the individuality of the other person and his ownership of himself, and vice versa. He accepts my individuality and my ownership of myself. As Hopper explains, following Habermas, the mere fact that we are conversing and arguing implicitly provides the foundation for the entire voluntary social process based on free cooperation and the capitalist system, namely each person's private ownership of himself. Otherwise there would be no argumentation or discussion. Each person would simply take out a gun and shoot the other in the head. So if I argue with another I, the two of us are implicitly recognizing that the other is an autonomous entity, endowed with his own nature, and the owner of himself. From that point, in a logical deductive manner, and following a process parallel to that of Rothbard, Hopper constructs the whole theory of the market economy and the capitalist system with respect to ethics. Each person owns his own body and what he produces, and he can freely make exchanges with others, etc. So we have talked about Rothbard, we have talked about Nozick and his work Anarchy, State and Utopia, and we have discussed Hopper's contribution, which appears in his book A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism. Now I would also like to point out the contribution in the sphere of ethics made by Professor Kietzner, one of Mises's most beloved disciples. At the time of his retirement in 2001, Kietzner was a professor of economics at New York University. Kietzner is the great theorist of entrepreneurship, and he wrote a book titled Discovery, Capitalism and Distributive Justice, which we have translated into Spanish and published through Union Editorial. Well, along similar lines, but focusing on his theory of entrepreneurship, Kietzner also constructs an entire objective and thus consensual theory of social ethics. What is it based on? It is based on the principle of entrepreneurial creativity. That is, the principle that every human being, by his very nature, is endowed with an innate entrepreneurial capacity, which is both eminently creative and highly coordinating. Therefore, every man or woman, simply by virtue of being human, is endowed with the capacity to discover, see and create new ends and new means. Kietzner's theory is that merely by virtue of being human beings, we have this innate capacity to discover and create things. In fact, in my book, Socialism, Economic Calculation and Entrepreneurship, there is a theological digression in which I argue that if human beings have been created in the image and likeness of God, assuming for the sake of argument that God exists and is a being vastly above and beyond us, whom we cannot comprehend, and who created everything from nothing out of love, then the point of connection between God and man lies precisely in entrepreneurship. For even if man is a tiny being, a fly, an infinitesimal ant, he is still endowed with a capacity for creativity. We notice things that we had previously overlooked. And this creativity can be seen as our point of connection with God, as I assert in the theological digression in my book on socialism, which I presume you have read. Well, Kietzner argues that if every human being is endowed with this innate creative capacity, then it is obvious that every human being has the natural right to appropriate what she entrepreneurially creates, because, among other reasons, doing so does not harm anyone. Before she created it, it did not exist, and if I create something that did not exist before I created it, I am not harming anyone. I am benefiting myself, the creator. I take possession of what I have created. Furthermore, I am benefiting numerous other people, both known and unknown, who, through the market processes we have studied together in this course, and through voluntary exchanges, either directly or indirectly, in successive waves, are also going to take advantage of what I have created. Thus, the principle of the private appropriation of what one creates is very similar to the principle of occupatio re nullius, a Latin term referring to the appropriation of resources that belong to no one, which in Roman law is one of the traditional ways of acquiring property. Also similar is the principle of homesteading, the colonization principle by which settlers could occupy land that belonged to no one. Locke theorized about such a guideline in the 18th century. It is an intuitive principle we can all accept. It is consistent with the nature of creative human beings that each person takes possession of what he creates. Indeed, it is essential to our creative nature, because if we were not able to take possession of what we create, we would not even visualize new ends and new means, and our creative capacity would be blocked. Moreover, this principle does no harm to anyone, because when we appropriate something created from nothing, no one can complain that something has been taken from him, since the created thing did not exist before. Furthermore, as I have already pointed out, the things people create spread and benefit not only their original creators, but also everyone who trades or makes exchanges with them or imitates them. In fact, what is known as the Lockean proviso is unnecessary. When Locke developed his theory of colonization, he stipulated the condition that one could appropriate whatever he discovered. Think of a colonist who disembarked in America, as long as he left sufficient resources for those who would come after him. Well, this view is too materialistic. It is true that I cannot set foot in America and declare, "This whole continent belongs to me." No. What I discover, create and put effort into will be my house, whatever I grow, and the surrounding land. But I cannot declare the entire continent mine as was done in the past. In the name of the King of Spain, all of this is mine up to such and such a parallel. In that sense, Locke had a point. But in far more abstract terms, like in Kirchner's writings, when I create something that did not exist before, whether it be a piece of artwork, an academic work, or a previously overlooked idea for a new entrepreneurial project, a new program, a new operating system, Windows 2000 or whatever, I need not worry about leaving sufficient resources for those who come after me, because we are not speaking in objective material terms about resources that could be blocked for those who came later. I have simply created from nothing something that did not exist in the world before I created it. No one could have said, "Mr. Miguel de Cervantes, please leave some of your ideas about Don Quixote unused, so that Avellaneda can write his spurious second part." No. The ideas already existed. They were there, and they belonged entirely to Cervantes. He took them up and wrote what would go down in history as one of the immortal works of mankind. Thus, the matter of the Lockean proviso is resolved, thanks to the more abstract concept of the right to private property, based on the principle of entrepreneurial creativity which Kirchner develops in his work. You will see that these four efforts, and others that are being made, contribute to the building of a discipline which is objective, and thus consensual. If someone coercively and forcibly imposes something on another person against his will, then based on the natural law, on Rothbard's axiom of self-ownership, on Hopper's argumentation principle, on Kirchner's principle that each person has a right to appropriate the results of his own entrepreneurial creativity, or on a combination of all of these more or less similar approaches, we can show that a behavior is bad in and of itself.